Okay, welcome again, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and if some people log on in the next few minutes, that's great. Welcome. We're happy to have you all here for tonight's alternate currents panel discussion, Doing Well, Doing Good, Anti-Capitalism for Artists. My name is Peter. I work at Amplify Arts, and alternate currents is one of the programs that we run, one of our cornerstone programs that works to center artist-led change through critical discussion, collective learning, and sorry, I lost my train of thought. Creative research. So this program includes 3 different parts: a discussion series that we're all participating in tonight, a blog, and a working group of 10 artists who help to shape the program and move it forward. Our panelists tonight, Bilgesu, Sisman, Krieg, Dawaune, Lamont, Jared, Packard, have all participated in one capacity or another. In alternate currents, we have some former working group members here, some current working group members here, some blog contributors. So we're really thankful they were all able to join us. So this discussion is just one part of a year-long investigation of how regenerative economies and alternative modes of exchange might bring about more just and equitable futures, and not just for artists, for everybody. Our panelists will be in conversation with each other for 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. But please, in the meantime, feel free to use the Q&A if you have thoughts that you would like to share. That the Q&A will be active throughout the discussion. I'll just mention quickly that a video and a transcript of tonight's discussion will be posted to the Alternate Currents blog in a couple of weeks. So you can find it there, and a lot of other great discussions like this one. They're all on our website at amplifyarts.org. Lastly, I'll just say again, thank you. We really appreciate all of you participating and your willingness to engage in critical discussions like this with us. We want to say thank you to the Sherwood Foundation, whose support makes alternate currents programming possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jared.
Thank you, Peter, and Amplify Arts. You guys do such important work in terms of facilitating critical discourse in Omaha and the region. And yeah, just really grateful to be here and to be assembled with this motley crew. So looking forward to jumping into this conversation. Maybe to start off with introductions. I'm Jared Packard. I am an artist, a painter, and a curator. I'm here based in Omaha, where I've been for the last 4 years. I'm really interested in questions around capitalism as they intersect with art practices and the way that capitalism kind of like forges, but also unmakes identities. And I think artists' way of kind of working through those questions are really nimble and uniquely adept to have those conversations. So yeah, I'm eager to learn from y'all today. Maybe I'll pass off to Dawaune. Do you want to just say your name, where you're from, a little bit about your practice and what you're hoping to get out of today's conversation?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. My name is Dawaune Lamont. I'm born and raised in Omaha, but I'm currently in Chicago. Visual and performing artist, graphic designer, and photographer. And a lot of my work is based in community and responding to community needs in space. And so I'm really interested in talking about abundance and regenerative economies and this kind of, taking a kind of a spiritual approach through art to kind of address some of these disparities. So, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Bilgesu, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Bilgesu. I'm from Istanbul, Turkey originally, and I've been in Omaha for kind of over a year now. I'm currently working as the programming director at Film Streams. But I'm also a screenwriter, I guess. So my interest in the topic tonight goes back to like my, past organizing practices that had, taken inspiration from like models of like participatory and direct democracy, like an abolitionist framework, as well as the idea of the commons. So I've been part of like multiple organizations and like efforts to bring those ideas into practice, whether that was in the university that I was working at, as well as in like places like, the Industrial Workers of the World chapter in Chicago. I was in Chicago for a while. Chicago DSA, etc. So I'm looking forward to like talk about tonight's topic because it's been something that I've been thinking quite a bit, especially with regards to art exhibition and the role of nonprofits with regards to like either further strengthening the tie or severing the tie between art and wealth.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Parker?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Parker Krieg. I currently teach in the Exploratory and Interdisciplinary Studies program here at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. My background's in English, cultural studies, and environmental humanities. So I guess my area of practice is the academia, the university for now. And so I'd say I started thinking kind of more seriously about the politics of culture as a musician in a DIY and anarchist-oriented hardcore band in the scene back in the early aughts. We were touring internationally, and this was at the tail end of kind of like the anti-globalization movement. And in places like Italy and Germany, we would play squats and social centers. And it was there I was exposed to autonomous Marxism as kind of a living body of critique and analysis of practices of production in different areas. So I try to bring that back to my work in academia, historicizing ideas about nature. And as an instructor, introducing students to different disciplines and ways of knowing the world. So glad to be here.
Awesome. We have such a great spectrum of experiences and perspectives that I'm excited to see where our conversation goes. As I was kind of like thinking through for our conversation today, I was reflecting on kind of like my childhood. I grew up internationally because my parents did international development work, which is kind of this like kind of opaque term, and doing public health services, but also kind of economic growth. And it was only later in life that I realized like it was kind of presented as this like charitable service to the world. But only later in life, moving back to the States, I was like, oh, they were just like spreading capitalism across the globe. They were just like helping. It was like they're funded by the American government to help other countries be more capitalistic so that they could be better trading partners on a global stage. And it was this real weird kind of inversion that I kind of, when I fully understood the context of kind of like what I thought my childhood was about. And yeah, so I don't know, I say that because capitalism is a complex thing. There's a lot of countries that are wish for an economy like the United States, and yet we are kind of dealing with pretty deep injustices and political unrest, and not to be melodramatic, but like the end of the world with like climate disaster. So like the stakes couldn't be higher. So with that context, sorry to make it really dire, but maybe to dial it into the personal, I'm curious to hear a little bit about, maybe you could flesh out a little bit more about your practices and the ways that capitalism has shaped the way that you create.
I'll start. So I'm in Chicago, like I mentioned earlier. I moved here in December of last year. And, I lived in Omaha I'm 28 years old, so most of my life. And, I would say I started working as an artist within the last like 10 years or so. And so in that, I started to figure out what my practice was. I always drew, I did all these things, but I also realized that like community facilitation work and doing engaging with people about what they want in their environment. I led a lot of like urban design studies and conversations in North Omaha, and then responded to those findings and the information with art, journalism, writing, those types of things. And then I started Noise Omaha, and with that I learned okay, here I am just like writing and wanting to connect people. And now I'm running a nonprofit because that was the avenue that was the most available to me. And then as soon as I got involved with that, I was like, whoa, the nonprofit industrial complex is real. And there's a lot of stipulations and relationships and politics. And, you know, then I was like, well, what is a foundation? And I was like, oh, a foundation is essentially like legal money laundering for corporations. Wow. Like I didn't realize it was, I mean, it might be a little abrasive for some, but it's, you know, here's a profit that's extracted through an extractive means, and then they take their excess profits and put it into a foundation for a tax write-off and say, well, look at all the good that we're doing, when that good could have just been done if it wasn't taken from the community that was extracted from in the first place. And when I started like connecting those dots, I was like, whoa, you know, here I am in the heart of North Omaha, you know, talking with Black people constantly about, you know, home ownership and land and cooperative economies and the things that we desperately need. And, you know, around us, we have these machinations of decisions that are just kind of being made rapidly. And so I became really embroiled in that system. And then when the library demolition conversation started last year, and realizing that Heritage Services and like these nonprofits boarded by all of the CEOs of the company are making these decisions, I was just like, oh, wow. Like, you know, they're like, well, you should be grateful that this is even happening, and that, you know, we have such generous donors who are willing to do this. And I'm like, well, we wouldn't need them if we were, you know, people were actually compensated what they're contributing. And so all that to say, like, I really started to find myself kind of ostracized from the spaces that I was working in. And so my regular income was essentially evaporated, because what I was saying was contrary to what a lot of institutions were comfortable protecting. They're like, well, that's where our money comes from, and so we can't say that, because then that's going to affect us. And I was like, I mean, I understand that. At the same time, if we recognize that there's an intrinsic harm to this, and that as you know, public service institutions, that we are only maintaining a system of inequity, then what are we actually doing? And so, you know, when I applied for jobs and things, and I'm like, here's the radical lens I'm coming from, I didn't get calls back or any of those things, because they're like, no, we're trying to maintain a hierarchy here. And so 22 led me to really turning to donation-based art. Because through my speaking, through my organizing, through just the things I had built in the past, folks became aware of who I am as an individual, and were like, well, we want to invest in you. You know, you say things, you speak in a certain way, you interact in a certain way that, like, I wish I could, or I felt comfortable doing so. So if I can support you somehow, then that helps me feel like I'm doing something good. And so, you know, I started creating stickers, I started making posters, I started, these are things that I've been doing for a while, but I've then turned my time to that, because I was like, well, if I can create an artifact that is symbolic and representative of who I am and the things that I believe in, and people are interested in having those artifacts around them, then, like, let me make that with the utmost integrity that I can possible, and be transparent about that process. And so since coming to Chicago, I've really been able to, like, connect with other artists who are doing similar work. And I've been following the work of Theaster Gates, who's based here in the South Side, and his practice of redirecting Art World Capital and using that for direct reinvestment in South Side, as well as you know, he has a Rebuild Foundation, which is a nonprofit, and is also a professor at University of Chicago, where he's, you know, working with students who go to this institution, telling them about the challenges he faces with the university. So, you know, I've been able to do some of that work with Creighton University, my alma mater, talking about North Omaha and systems of economy and racism and redlining, and, you know, and they pay me for that time. And so I've been able to find some interesting channels where my voice is not only just like people want to hear it, but is being compensated and supported in that way. All the while I'm thinking, okay, how can I with the capital that I do receive, you know, I'm paying my bills so I can like have a place to live and food to eat. But then I'm also thinking about what am I investing in? And I've really kind of strayed away from conventional investment models because in portfolios and things like that, because they're not reflective of my personal ethos. And so I've been looking more into like mutual aid and cooperative structures to kind of be a home for the energy and the capital that I'm able to acquire and outside of. So that's a long way of saying like it's changed a lot. And there is definitely struggle. I have to learn how to do a lot with a little bit. But that's also the work of an artist. So, you know, but I really believe in the abundance mentality of like, you know, we're being prepared to receive right now and things in a different way. And so it's really reflected my spiritual practice of like making room for that abundance and wealth isn't just money in a bank account somewhere. True wealth comes from relationships, comes from community. It comes from, you know, having your basic needs met, and that prior to the system of capital we're familiar with today, people were able to meet those needs in community. That was the first insurance. And so that's where I'm personally coming from.
Thank you. There's a lot to tease out there. What really struck me was kind of like this irony of like your voice, like in order to maintain the status quo, they couldn't, you know, organizations couldn't uplift your voice, even if they appreciated what you were saying, and like really cutting to the core of like the complexity of the way that the system actually functions. But are there the other you want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in, kind of maybe just like take from there and then be a bridge to Packard, because my background is in academia too. So I came to the US to get enrolled in the graduate program at DePaul University in Chicago. So the way that we were being paid stipends was through our teaching. So we were thrown into the adjunct system like pretty early on. For those of you who might not be familiar, those are like temporary positions without a guarantee for any kind of like job security, usually without benefits, usually in like overextension of your time and capacity. So over like 5 years or so, I have been part of like at least some efforts to get some kind of healthcare for grad students. At the university, we had some wins on that domain, but we were still like really lacking solid enough base to kind of like unionize, because it was still like very contentious with the small graduate student population that we had, as well as the kind of like barriers that the university administration like putting in our ways. So with the pandemic, my shift like took the form of a career pivot, where I was like, this is not doable. Like the job market for academia is very bleak, and I was feeling very disconnected from a general public in my work, besides the teaching. So I decided to like pivot away and kind of almost build from scratch to go into like the film industry, not on the production side, but more the kind of like behind the curtains, like development, as well as like analysis and criticism. And my credentials weren't like worth shit, to be honest, when I was trying to make that switch. So now it's like sounds really weird, but I did like 6 unpaid internships like within, I think, the span of like a year, just to build up that experience, to be able to say, well, I guess I have experience. I was able to like switch to a part-time job from there, but then it was a startup that was using 150 unpaid interns per semester for the kind of work that they needed to get done. So it just felt really weird to be in a position where I kind of like made it out of that pool, and it was still like within a system that kind of like perpetuated that kind of like inequity. And then, yeah, these are not very cool things. And then my move to Omaha came as a response to me accepting a job at Film Streams. And I was really looking forward to that. So I no longer had to deal with that part of capitalism, but as Dawaune was saying, the nonprofit industrial complex reared its ugly head in a sense. There have been parts of my job that I was like really enjoying and that I'm really proud of. Like I spearheaded like a program that gave space for nonprofits and other community organizations to like host events at our space with our help, and us helping them financially as well by like, you know, paying honorariums for speakers and whatnot. But I feel like film, the art form film itself being an industry, even from its very like early days, kind of like really makes it complicated. Even in an art house space, even with like indie film, which was, you know, like started as some kind of like reaction to the mainstream film industry trying to kind of like get out of its like strangleholds as much as possible. But just with every domain, capitalism have been able to like integrate it within its own system. So there's all kinds of like informal contractual obligations that we are still like beholden to. And yeah, Dawaune just already talked about the nonprofit system, so I'm not gonna reiterate that. So that was kind of like my experience. And on the side of like being a creator, again, it's very much for like getting a film made, you need investment, and that's either gonna come from some kind of like grant funding, which is meager and like very competitive to get, or you need to get like capital investment, which is again almost impossible because people are looking to invest in things that they know are going to make profit, and you're not able to showcase that unless, you know, you're not taking any risks, and you're able to like build on things that have already been successful. So all of that, I guess, is the way that I have been like working within the confines of this like economic system.
Thank you. Parker.
Yeah, thanks, Bilgesu. You're giving me flashbacks to my time in grad school at the University of Oregon, where which has one of the oldest graduate employee unions in the country. I think it was founded in the early 70s, but in my 6 years there, during one of the bargaining sessions with the university tried to essentially take over the health insurance plan that the union itself, the graduate employees, had managed for, I want to say, a decade or more. And of course, the university wanted to manage that, cut it down. They also wanted to strip out parental leave and medical leave from the bargaining side, which all the other state employees of Oregon received. So there were a number of these issues, and I think because of that, they stretched it out over 2 years, and that resulted in one of the longest graduate employee strikes in the country up to that point. So they've I mean, eventually we won, but that was, you know, not the first time that I saw, you know, examples of what's called now the neoliberal university, the post-welfare state university, that is increasingly gutted of state funding, which has all kinds of belt tightening implications, cuts to the humanities, cuts to the parts of the any part of education that can't be seen as directly producing an object of value. And I think that's something that the Amplify Arts and a lot of the conversations around, you know, the conversations we're having here about how artists can explore new forms of value creation and kind of valorize forms of value production in areas that don't often get recognized: gendered forms of labor, environmental labor, and, you know, and creative labor. So that's, I guess that's one point I would highlight in terms of capitalism impacting practices. But another point, at you know, my time there, I was also part of a student housing cooperative across 3 houses, 80+ students, And you know, I was focused for 3 years making sure students in that housing cooperative had all their needs met, and was, as a conflict resolution coordinator, you know, I saw the ways that students were really struggling just to make it in school, even the ones with scholarships and those sort of need-based scholarships. And that's really also what brought me here at UNO. The exploratory studies program is precisely for vulnerable students and making those kinds of resources available to them, showing them the broad picture of what an education can provide. But at the same time, that's the front lines of what's some have called the scam of contemporary university, or feeling like a scam, in other words. And it's hard sometimes because the students will tell you stories, and working within that institution, being sort of in the front of the classroom, you have access to things that they don't, and you give them as many opportunities as you can find in your position. But it still comes down to that neoliberal transformation of public institutions writ large, that I think goes back to what Dawaune mentioned at the very beginning, of public institutions increasingly pushing elements of the social safety net onto private individuals, private organizations. We expect artists to somehow be social workers now, and to do kinds of work that they shouldn't be expected to do necessarily. So I think that's kind of the connection there with my experience in the university and the nonprofit world.
And could I just add one thing to that, Jared? Because it makes me think of the connections here between the three of us. I mean, it's also about like the way in which like these foundations and like, the private like funding model is basically taking away the tax dollars that would go into like public goods such as universities and, public support for the arts. So I was doing some research last week on this question, and it is said that like up to 74% of every donated like dollar is basically like tax subsidized. So anything that, that any kind of like money that the wealthy people are putting into these specific like foundations or like advisor funds are actually like taking away from what would be like tax money that would pay for public goods.
As all of you were sharing, something that stood out to me was that in each of your kind of accounts, there was like a refusal, kind of, whether that was like through a strike or pivoting to a different career or leaving a city. There's kind of this a rejection. And I think the deviousness of capitalism would be to be able to frame that as a failure, and in place of being like, we're privileging productivity and efficiency and output. And I'm interested in maybe spending a moment on some of those pivots, let's reframe failure as a generative practice, as a productive practice, rather than something that is like, hurtful or harmful. And I'm curious, does that lens resonate at all, or how does that land with you?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think in order to be generative or regenerative, or to have something that is healing, there requires rejections of things that are not. And it can be difficult when you're like, well, you've got to pay rent, you've got to do these things, you've got to make these certain decisions, otherwise you don't have a place to live. And that's where like the compulsory nature of capitalism happens, where like your basic needs are tied to it. But I found that like through that rejection, through that kind of like, wait, I'm going to protect my peace, I'm going to focus on like what my wellness looks like, and it clearly doesn't involve this environment right now. I found that I've been able to put myself in environments that are more generative, still within the landscape that we're in. And we're able to have meaningful conversations about investment and design and art and our place in it. And I feel like I've been able to find community that can help inform this conversation beyond where it currently am, because it can be really scary. And, you know, I have had to think about, you know, I don't own a car. There are a lot of things I don't have that I don't feel like I need to, and I've learned to adapt with. But like, there are lots of things that I have to opt away from in order able to survive and to make decisions and be like, I can live off of $50 for the next so many days because I'm gonna have to. Like, but then, you know, that's also pushed me into looking into pantries, you know, looking into things like SNAP and public benefits and things that, like, once I received SNAP, I was like, why doesn't everyone get this? Like, why don't we just make sure everyone has food they can eat? You know what I mean? Like, it's got me thinking a lot about once I was able to, once I had to kind of say no to certain things and turn my attention to others, I realized there's actually a lot of tools that could help us and infrastructure that does exist, but it's not being supported or funded in the way that it needs to, because there's this like rejection towards equity. Capitalism is a very exclusive practice. It's very much about like, you know, how much can one person have or one group have, and then, you know, making sure that only those people can enjoy it over others, rather than seeing the planet and our experiences as human beings as abundance and something to be shared. And I think with the pandemic and since then, how things have evolved is that we're starting to realize we don't have as much community as we need. And when things start to break down, like banks are busting and all these things, we realize that like insurance companies aren't going to save us, banks aren't going to save us, the, you know, social media companies aren't going to save us. It's going to be your neighbor. It's going to be your family. It's going to be your community. And that is like one of our most valuable forms of wealth. There's a great book called True Wealth that was shared with me, and it talks about these, you know, mapping our life systems on in ecological systems, and it looks at, you know, mycelium, it looks at animals, it looks at, you know, water molecules, and then brings that all the way back to who we are as human beings, and realizing that wealth doesn't have to be something that is stolen or extracted or you know, garnered through means of terror. That actually we could generate wealth through healing land, healing each other, cleaning water. And there are actually some startups that are looking at how they can use the blockchain to then as a form of to mine Bitcoin or another form of cryptocurrency tied to, you know, trash remediation and cleaning up water sites, and thinking about how can doing good actually mean being taken care of, whereas, you know, whereas the inverse is the case, whereas like the more you extract, the more you get back. What is it? The more you give back, the more that you get. And you know, you can see that in karma. You see that in indigenous practices. You see it in old in ancient ancestral practices, and that's what they've been saying for thousands of years. And now we're finally having to reconcile what that looks like in real time.
Yeah, and it's like no surprise that this is the case, because capitalism is, as the specific like economic like organization of like, you know, relations of production, is about breaking down our collective capacity for action that comes to determine our lives, where it's also like using our collaborative capacities at work to create even further like surplus value and extract it. So like when we're talking about, you know, like your question, Jared, about, you know, those like pivots as like being seen as failure, it can be seen as failure or it can be seen as success, but it's also always going to be kind of like mapped onto the individual in this like neoliberal like ideology. It's your failure or it's your success as an individual, which like goes hand in hand with this like absolute expectation and maybe even the necessity like that we have in our present for us to like constantly market and like commodify ourselves to be successful on the labor market, and like the kind of like conditions which constantly like individualize us, isolate us, set barriers for us to like find community, build community, foster community, right? Because like a strike is a community, like a food pantry is a community, finding like solace in like your loved ones outside of like productive relationships is a community. But it is like really hard to find those communities and to create those communities because rent is expensive. We're being like kicked out of like all urban spaces, where any kind of urban space is becoming like just a playground for the rich. We're not able to like connect to each other because the majority of our time is like taken away from us so that we can sustain our being, so we can have shelter and food, etc. And we come home and we're drained and we don't have the time or the energy and sometimes even the will to like even reach out to the people who are closest to us. Our partner will be sitting at the other end of the couch and they're looking at their phone because they're also just trying to chill out because tomorrow is another work day. So like the conditions within which like we are like isolated is like, it's no kind of like coincidence. I don't remember where I read this. I don't know where it's coming from, but like, it's not only that, like that, the working class is not organized enough, but the capitalist class is actually pretty much organized because they are constantly trying to like either uphold the status quo or actually like better it in a way to continue these like exploitative, extractive relationships where we are pushed further and further into isolation and they are further and further like conglomerated and kind of like almost like condensed into the minimum number of like stakeholders that get to like control and determine the lives and livelihoods of the whole world's population.
Yeah, I don't know how I could follow that up, except maybe to ask, like, why now? Are artists turning to alternative economies in maybe a much more direct and explicit, literal way? So I was thinking, how artists in the past have responded to capitalism. And I've always been more drawn to artists and writers who emphasize complicity with things. They always have kind of more interesting critiques than the ones who start by trying to extract themselves from the situation. But we have, satire, social commentary in the past, art as a form of movement building, kind of reappropriation, of consumer images. And now we actually have like the, the example of something like NFTs and crypto, of artists actively engaging some of the more, advanced sectors of the finance economy and actually pushing that further to take what those sectors are doing with the value form itself. Like the way crypto is sort of pulling apart in different ways, use value, exchange value, and then speculative investment value, and actually forcing these like digital objects to operate differently through these sort of these smart contracts or staking mechanisms, that Dawaune was talking about. So I'm interested in those sorts of complicities as a critical practice as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about Clement Greenberg, the mid-century American critic who talks about artists being tied to patrons and the wealthy elite by an umbilical cord of gold, meaning like, it's so good you can't cut it, right? And I think maybe there's some truth to that still now, but as you were just pointing out, Parker, I think it's far more complex now. And I'm curious, to that point, I think all of you have touched on some of the imagined alternatives or real life alternatives to capitalism. I want to give some space to flesh some of those ideas out and what you feel excited by and continue to invest in that feels like it could be a good alternative.
I have been kind of like off the grid when it comes to working in community building and organizing, but when I was leaving, I was very much interested in like neighborhood councils, workers' councils, which then would like translate into like community like held spaces in like community land trusts, as well as like, you know, places like housing co-ops. So I think like there are models that are still like operative that can still be like tried and experimented with. Like I don't feel like we even need to like, you know, reinvent the wheel. There is actually a lot of like successful practices that have been like going on for like years now, like Corporation Jackson, that I think artists could like really get inspiration from. And with regards to like why now, like kind of just like a little note to that question, that previous question, I feel like it's because like it's become like it's, you cannot deny the fact that like the way that like this art distribution is now organized, like musicians making a fraction of like a cent when their like album is like, you know, listened to on Spotify, making people like realize, no, we actually literally cannot depend on these like big corporations to get our art out, to make any kind of like living. It's like beyond exploitative at this point, where like creative production is on the one hand like exalted in ideology, like, you know, these geniuses, whatever, but like when it comes to like actual compensation, literally nothing is given. And, you know, audiences are also like accustomed to think, you know, I should get this for free, because that's been kind of like the model, kind of like digging under like anything that could sustain artists, you know, public funding on one hand, and any kind of like, you know, I don't know, model where artists could be compensated for what they do is gone. And I feel like people are like in dire situations, and that's why it feels like urgent to try something else, because what's currently happening is not working at all, like not at all.
Mhm.
Yeah, yes. You know, but I'm really dedicating this year for me personally to traveling to different communities in cities where I have friends, and kind of just spending time in those environments and seeing what those networks are and how they operate. You know, a good friend of mine, he was my college roommate, lives in Gainesville, Florida. And we were talking regularly about consulting and like starting a consulting practice and what does that look like and what kind of consulting are we doing. And we came to the terms, you know, integrative sustainability, because we're like, sustainability as a concept is nice, but when we think about integrative, what is that? Well, why don't I start with the self? Where are you? Who are you? What do you value? What are your habits? What do you actively practice on a daily basis? What are your rituals? What do you feed yourself? How much water do you drink? When you discard something, where does it go? Why do you throw it away like that? Could you compost it? Could you recycle it? You know, like, and sometimes there's the, you know, well, why are we spending so much time on individual? We should be penalizing the corporations who are creating the product. I absolutely agree. At the same time, if we want to approach those things, we ourselves need to address our own actions and decisions. That also informs who our community is. So you go from the people to your place. You know, what is your neighborhood? What is your connection within your neighborhood? Do you know your neighbors? Do you facilitate interactions? Do you go to gatherings? When you're at those gatherings, what kind of conversations are you having? Are you just complaining about the workday, or are you talking about how we're changing the workday? I mean, and then those kinds of connective parts start to then inform the broader sense of place and space, and therefore the planet. You know, like there are things happening in Jerusalem right now that are nuts, and I have friends who are there, and I'm like, I'm not in Jerusalem, But what I can do is pay attention to how I'm responding to this information, witnessing how only a few months ago they were all partying in the streets. Now they are also showing up in the streets in response to the government. That is because those relationships, those personal, interpersonal relationships were able to be leveraged into revolutionary ones. So that helps me, remember, okay, if all the power goes out of my block, who am I responding to? Who's responding to me? Who's checking in on me? I don't know. And a lot of our cities, that's something I'm witnessing in Chicago and like different neighborhoods and their relationships to each other. And so, I really, when I think about this integrative sustainability, I invite us to all think of ourselves and the relationships we have with ourselves, and then how that translates into our relationships to the people around us, our coworkers, our family, our friends, and what we are doing in our immediate environment. Because when groups like Benson First Friday started with an individual, now as an organization, is now leading cultural districts and is now garnering funding, is now leveraging that creative ability and coalescing it and then flipping it and turning it into something that then sustains and supports those artists. I feel like that's a good example of, here's a nonprofit who is leveraging community and creativity as the focal point and is using that to gain more ground rather than recede it. So that's a lot of where my mind goes. I'm also doing bartering and donation base. Make art. If you're interested in something that I like and I make, it was 66 cents each to make one of these stickers. You can, if whatever it is of value to you and you're the means to have, I will send it to you. And what that helps me do is sustain myself and go get food and pay my transit card so I can continue to make art and continue to be present for conversations like this one. So, I heard Theaster say the other day, he had to really navigate the feeling of, I'm making these artifacts, I'm making sculptures, I'm performing, I'm doing all these things. And there are certain people with a lot of money who are just buying the thing that I made because they want to feel better about not doing something else. And he had to reconcile with, well, if I'm a person who is able to attract the means, then I need to direct those means. I need to inform those means. And so what I'm definitely seeing in a place like Chicago are a lot of artists who came from maybe just an artifact making process or poetry or something, and that's culminating now into, they're becoming developers, they're becoming educators, they're becoming organizers. Or bringing those worlds together so that when they are able to leverage and amass their fandom and turn it into a direct way of changing the system. So if I think about like Doja Cat or like Lil Nas X, yeah, they have concerts and like they're fun, but if they one day were like, hey, millions of fans, we're gonna do this. They would probably have a couple of large groups of people doing lots of things. And so there's a lot of power. That's why TikTok is under attack, because they recognize that millions of people are able to get together and have discussions about dismantling or creating systems outside of capitalism. And the federal government is terrified of that because they don't understand how it works. So, what I'm going to end with is like, recognize that you have a lot more influence on yourself and in your community than you think you do. And then that like those systems and those networks are some of our most powerful ways of, creating outside or transmuting the energy we receive from capitalism into new systems, new paradigms, or old systems and old paradigms.
I want to hear from the other panelists, but I also want to flag to our audience to please, if you have questions, please chime in on the Q&A and we'll get to them. Do Parker or Bilgesu have other thoughts on kind of like productive alternatives to capitalism?
I don't know about alternatives to capitalism, but to answer your last question about what I'm going to be doing next is more things like this. You know, I moved back to Omaha sort of in the middle of the pandemic. Before then, I was in Helsinki, Finland, and so I felt like really it was just this last year that I was actually here. So I want to get out. I want to turn more of my writing to contributing to things like Amplify Arts, or to make my writing and work as an academic more useful to an actual communities. So much like what Bilgesu said earlier, you know, giving up that ideal of a tenure track position, which really doesn't exist anymore, and stop writing for that, and to make my own labor, I guess, put towards different ends. Not overthrowing capitalism necessarily, but maybe helping to build some community here in my own way.
Yeah, and just kind of like a very small like addition to what you're saying, Peter. And this is kind of like me telling this to myself too, like nurturing our courage to like stand up for ourselves and for our fellows, remembering our words, remembering the word of our, fellow, both human and non-human beings, to take the risk to go against the grain, like to, like assess risks with like more, I don't know. I'm just trying to be less cowardly in my life. I think that's like one of my ultimate goals, to like preserve my integrity, my dignity, and just become more courageous as I age, because I feel like that's really like what makes like life worth living to me. And to just like foster care for each other, especially when we're at our worst, whether that worst is the financial worst or emotional worst, mental worst, just like be good to each other, and remember to like be there for each other as much as we can.
Yeah, there's as we're talking about kind of creative practices, the title of this talk, right, is Anti-Capitalism for Artists. And there is something about, in a certain kind of art world, where the genius individualism of an artist is kind of commodified and packaged and sold as kind of this like keen insight into the world and how it functions or something. And unfortunately, I think that's like what most people think of who are not in the art world about the art world, or what the art world is. And kind of through our conversation today, there's something about how to bind. Yes, I think artistic practices require a certain kind of like individual kind of vision and a kind of unique perspective on life, but how to tether that to things like care and community and alternative modes of production that don't fall under kind of like this capitalist, like Ayn Rand style, like rugged individualism, like out to conquer the world. I guess that was just a little bit of a ramble, but maybe just to like tie it back to like the title of this, like Anti-Capitalism for Artists. I'm curious to hear any thoughts on kind of like what kind of the role of the artists, and we can think about that a little bit expansively, what that might, what part does that play in kind of like our society at large, but then also within capitalism?
I think about this a lot, and something I talked about during our alternate currents working group a few years ago, of like, should we be even making objects? And when I think about that, I'm moving from objects to artifacts, and thinking a lot about how the things that we are making right now are symbolic and representative of the change and the transformations that we are creating. And people are like, well, AI can just generate something, and so why do you even need an artist to do those things? And it's like, because all of those things, all those generations are coming from us. They're reflections of who we are. The only reason that they have data points to create is because we created the data points. And human beings will always be valuable or always be capable and and that our value is not tied to our production or our labor, is intrinsic to who we are. And, you know, I found that through the last few years, as I've incurred a lot of just like financial strain, I've had to really come back to myself and be like, I am always worthy. I am always abundant, no matter what. My account may be negative, that millions and this, and they want this and they want that, but those numbers and those documents aren't who I am. They're reflective of a system that doesn't that doesn't recognize the value that is intrinsic to me and the relationships that I create. And so, you know, I feel like I've come back to my own personal spiritual practice in that way of like, as an artist, what are your foundations? What is your ritual? How is the art for you? And then when you are in a place to have the art for you, when you're in a place to share it, when you're in a place to give it away, when you're, and what are you saying when that is shared? And just ask yourself. It doesn't always have to be a big grandiose dissertation or any of those things, or, you know, fit into art world vernacular, but ask yourself what it means to you and share that. And what I've found through that is that a lot of people have resonated with the message of why I make my art and what it means to me. And then they're like, well, I would like that. I want that around me. And so, you know, that's what I say is come back to you, ask yourself why you do what you do in the first place, and root yourself in that. And then, you know, you'll be able to find other people who truly believe in what you're doing and why you do it. And that value, that abundance, those types of things start to attract themselves, while you're also having very frank discussions about what your values don't look like. And so I've been able to personally move my income streams and receive them from people that truly believe in me and what I'm doing, rather than having to appease a system that I don't want to be a part of.
Your question, Jared, and one's comments. I don't have a lot to add here, but a thought experiment just like pops up in my head, which is like, what would an art strike look like? What if tomorrow every creative worker stopped creating? What would that world look like? And what would that mean for people who create and people who, I don't want to say consume, but people who seek out that creation, who experience that creation, who want to have that creation in their lives? So I'll just leave it as a question, as something to like think about, as a little like prompt for a social sci-fi story.
That's great. Yeah, it makes me think of, you know, the question about what is the role of the artist today, and maybe it's to provide some sort of model or many models for other kinds of knowledge workers, care workers, environmental workers, in terms of how they relate to their labor, and in recognizing those differences and similarities like across different sectors of society at this point, and to coordinate some sort of labor resistance, some sort of strike like that. One of the questions that Dawaune's response made me think of is, you know, you mentioned the commons a couple times. How can we use this new AI abundance, if we want to call it that, that's based on the abundance that other people have created? How can we use that commons or foreground the existence of a commons, while also emphasizing the fact that individuals need to be compensated for what they've done, what they've contributed?
Yeah, those are really beautiful thoughts and questions to kind of like round out our conversation, and kind of a reminder of like, so much of this feels so daunting, and to talk about the scale and the scope of like these systems and the way that they impact us as individuals and us as communities. It can get, I don't know, I find for myself, it can feel kind of like clammy hands, like, what am I even going to begin to do like about this? And so to like reground ourselves into kind of like self-care and to those around us, and it's kind of like the optimism of like what we as creative people can offer to each other and to ourselves and to the world. I think is a really lovely way to kind of like wrap up our conversation today. So I want to like a big thank you to the three of you and your generosity and thoughtfulness and sharing.
Thank you for moderating, Jared. Thanks for your questions.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all. Have a great night and more soon.
Bye, everyone.
Absolutely. Take care. Be well.